Welcome everyone. Today we're scouting a field of sunflowers and we're starting to see the disease rust. Take a look at the leaves, especially on the lower canopy. Do you see the small brown specks? These are called pustules, and each pustule is full of dusty, cinnamon brown spores that cause rust. You can see pustules on the tops of the leaves, but they tend to be most apparent on the undersides of the leaves. Sometimes the pustules have a narrow golden or chlorotic halo. We commonly see rust appear first in the lower canopy and progress up the leaves as the growing season continues. Look up to see severe rust infection on leaves. When leaves are severely infected with rust, they will turn brown, curl, wilt, and in some cases die. Although commonly thought of as a foliar disease, rust can infect any healthy green tissue. Look around to see images of stems, petioles, and bracts infected with rust. As plants mature and the growing season nears its end, the dusty, cinnamon-brown pustules will become hard and turn black. Regardless of whether the pustules are cinnamon brown or black colored, where they occur, or how severe an epidemic is, the pustules always remain very small. The combination of pustule size, color, and morphology differentiate rust from every other disease of sunflower. Rust is one of the most common and economically important diseases of sunflower. However, its occurrence can be unpredictable and depends heavily on environmental and genetic factors. The amount of yield loss that rust causes is also unpredictable and depends on how early in the season the disease develops, how favorable the environmental conditions are for spread, and whether the sunflower grower is using any management tools. In the worst case scenario that I've seen, rust reduced yield by 80% in an unmanaged area of a field, but losses of 10 to 20% are much more common if the disease is left unmanaged. To effectively scout for rust and to manage rust, it's important to understand the disease cycle. In general, rust pathogens have a very interesting and complex cycle. The sunflower rust pathogen has 5 different spore stages, 4 of which you can see on infected plants in the field. Look up to learn about the disease cycle. The process begins with teleospores, which are the spores in the hard black pustules. Teleospores survive the winter in even the coldest climates where sunflower is grown. In the spring, teleospores germinate to produce microscopic basidium and basidiospores. Basidiospores infect the sunflowers to produce small orange bumps on the upper side of the leaves, called pycnia. In the right genetic conditions, the cycle continues and a cluster of small orange cups will form on the underside of the leaf, exactly opposite the pycnium. This structure is called an acium and is full of achiospores. Achiospores are wind dispersed and can infect new, healthy green sunflower tissue. The infection produces the first cinnamon brown pustules of the season, which are filled with another type of spore called uridinea spores. It's at this stage that a small number of random infections can quickly become a major epidemic. The light, dusty uridinea spores are easily dispersed to new sunflower tissue by wind. If the tissue remains wet for a prolonged period of time, like we see with heavy dews or fog, uridinea spores will infect the leaf. Depending on the temperature, a new pustule filled with more uridinea spores will appear in 7 to 14 days. As long as periods of prolonged leaf wetness occur, the cycle will repeat over and over until the end of the season. You can imagine how a few sporadic pustules can become an epidemic in a matter of weeks. Towards the end of the season, the brown uridinea pustules will turn into the hard black pustules called telea, which are filled with teleospores. It's the teleospores that can survive the winter. Sunflower rust can occur at any time in the season, so scouting for the disease is very important. When the pathogen overwinters, you're much more likely to see the disease start early in the season. Although rare, you may even see the early spore stages on the cotyledons. If you see rust early in the season, that field must be watched because an epidemic is much more likely to occur. A much more common situation is to see rust in the cinnamon brown pustule form first. Early in the season, we want to focus our scouting on areas of the field where leaves stay wet the longest. Commonly, rust first shows up along a shelter belt, which protects the sunflowers from the wind. In some cases, a shelter belt on the north or east side of the field will keep sunflowers shaded longer, which can also increase the time the leaves are wet. If rust is found anywhere in the field, it's likely to spread. We typically see rust first, and in greatest severity, on leaves in the lower to middle canopy. Those leaves are protected from the wind and sun and stay wet longer, creating ideal conditions for infection. As the sunflowers enter the bloom stage, use the scale you see in front of you to determine the rust severity on the upper 4 fully expanded leaves. I typically scout multiple locations in a field, looking at 10 plants each. If severity is 1% or greater at or before bloom, we recommend a fungicide application. In some recent studies, a fungicide was economically effective at even lower severities. Sunflower growers in our region have many fungicides that are efficacious on sunflower rust. Between 2016 and 2018, NDSU scientists evaluated 11 different fungicides in 5 different field trials. We tested fungicides from 3 different modes of actions organized by frac groups. Each trial was planted to a confection hybrid, and fungicides were applied at growth stage 5.2 or early bloom when only a trace of rust was observed on the upper 4 fully expanded leaves. By growth stage R6, rust was well established on the upper leaves at about 0.5% severity, but by R7, severity skyrocketed to over 6% on the non-treated control, about 2 to 6 times higher than the sunflowers treated with fungicides, and yield of the control was about 300 to 500 pounds less than the best fungicides. Selection of a hybrid resistant to sunflower rust is also an excellent management option. However, the sunflower pathogen can develop new races that overcome resistance genes, so it's still important to scout for rust. Volunteer sunflowers and stands of wild sunflowers should be destroyed. Both can keep the pathogen alive over winter and incite an epidemic in our commercial fields. Crop rotation is important to manage all sunflower diseases, including rust. However, because the pathogen can be dispersed by wind and over long distances, no length of crop rotation can guarantee that rust will not occur in your field.